One of the most important things to understand about the traumatic abuse we all suffer from to one degree or another is that it does not matter how intelligent you are mentally or how articulate you are about the terrain. Trauma is a biological mechanism. And without working through it and with it, through the body, with coping with effective and competent technique, it renders a split personality that will act irregardless of mental awareness, and to some extent irregardless of mental will, as we have in so many of the addiction coping mechanisms of trauma and abuse survivors. I want to outline this biological and psychological mechanism as an awareness of both the prison and also the process of liberation. The first step is the dissociation from self at an early age in response to shock, trauma, violation. The second or first, as parallel with this dissociation, the wounded, terrified child is loyal to the abuser/provider. The abuser is always in some way responsible for survival, security, love and belonging, etc., the basic human needs. And so it is typically the parent or caregiver in the environment. It can be a sibling, etc. But the wounded, terrified child is loyal to the abuser and the provider. In a healthy system, the big one attunes to the small one in a competent manner. In an unhealthy and parentally illiterate culture, the small one is asked to attune to the big ones. In a healthy culture, the big one meets the needs of the little one. In an abuse culture, the little one meets the needs of the big one. Thus occurs the embodiment of the abuse contract to protect the abuser and thus one's life. This child in a dissociated state with an enormous emotional charge around it that is associated with protecting life, with survival, governs the core emotion and the body, irrespective of what is mentally understood. This child must be loved and forgiven. And in an abuse cult, it is hated and shamed. I can't tell you the number of times in romantic situations where the wounded child in my partner presents itself. She bursts into tears. She does something irrational in response to the abuse contract. She won't look up. She refuses to tell the truth. The child is put on the spot and asked to break the abuse contract and doesn't respond. And she hates her child, apologizes for her child, feels embarrassed that her child exists, and either withdraws from the relationship permanently or temporarily, or masochistically attacks the child for ruining her life in an exact replication of the abusive parent's pattern of shaming, yelling at, and shouting at the infant for ruining, apparently, according to the parental narrative, the parent's life. You fucking child, I should never have had you. Why do you keep ruining it? Why did you run out into the street when I wasn't paying attention? The abusive parent in an abusive culture never says, Why do we build front doors in a culture that raises children right next to streets? Why do we not understand the lives of children? Why don't we have more adults in ratio to children? And why don't we get parental training in high school? An abusive culture or parent never asks these questions. They blame and shame the child for existing, for being born in a culture that is hostile to their well-being. This child must be loved and forgiven. And in the process, a new parent must emerge distinct from the wounded critical parent template that abused the child and has been internalized in every growing individual. The default mode is the deep emotional patterns of the abusive parent. At a certain level of competency, at a certain level of safety, the wounded child who is loyal to the abusive parent must transfer the loyalty that is earned to the new template of the nurturing parent. In the process, the child and the young retarded ego, the arrested ego, must face death in this reassociation, meaning the child dissociated from their body multiple times. The child agreed to hide in shame and protect the dignity of the big one, of the cult and of the parent. The child agreed to be hit and not run away because there was nowhere to go. The child agreed to carry the shame and abuse of the cult so that the abuser would not kill them. In coming back and speaking the truth and sharing the repressed feelings of that abuse dynamic, the child expects and believes, as the ego expects and believes, to be hated, to be hurt, and to die. It needs the love and protection of a larger self. If all that is available is a shame-based abuser, they will follow the contract dictated by the abuser. It's all my fault. I'm the one who's unlovable. You never do anything wrong. I will never tell the truth of your abuse. I will rename your cruelty and call it love. I will call your parental stupidity a great parent, if that's what it takes to get you to smile. I will hide my truth to elevate the delusion that you need to feel good about yourself. The child ego must face death in order to reintegrate, to assimilate, and mature. And it must be loved and forgiven, and a strong new parental template has to be in place before a regressed, traumatized inner child will make that choice to risk death. That is the biological sensation of shaking, of fight, of flight, of freezing, that the body will go through in order to come back to the present moment, in order to reintegrate as an adult. This is the key thing. The grown-up, we're not talking about adults, we're talking about grown children here. The grown-up is vulnerable, manipulatable, and helpless in a regressed state until this takes place. This is very rare without help. Trauma is one of the few psychological phenomena that, because it involves confronting death And because in an unsafe environment, and the internalized abuser is an unsafe environment for the internal abused regressed inner child, which is a real psychological part of both the biological memory and the psyche. The grown-up can be manipulated, can be violated, can be forced into abuse contracts, can become an abuser compulsively, will addictively pain manage with anything available, lies, truths, etc., until this facing of death occurs and the reintegration of the split self takes place. The regressed, wounded child holds the survival abuse contract in the framework of a regressed, abused child that depends on big ones in the outside, the projected abuser, to survive. You can go to a politician who has not done this work, and you can expose a sexual scandal that will destroy the image upon which they are basing their safety. A terrified, abused child is desperate to survive, feels the chronic fear of death, knows they've got to do anything to survive. If that's climbing the power train in an abuse cult, climbing the power ladder, and every abused individual abuses others in a vulnerable state. It may be psychological abuse, it may be abuses of power, it may be sexual abuse, it may be any number of different abuses. But when there is a lack of accountability, a lack of visibility behind closed doors, a terrified, regressed child inside a grown body that has a lot of power and no accountability will reenact the abuse at some level, because it is a release and a relief of the asymmetrical terror of the young one in relationship to the big one, to be a big one in relationship to the young one. It stabilizes the ego to abuse a small person in the same way one is terrified of and being abused in a regressed, dissociated state. The moment the dissociation happens, where there's a split off, where I am no longer conscious, I hate that part of myself, I banish that part of myself, it is not me, and I agree to keep the secret of the abuser, the secret that the abuse happened, the secret that it was sheer terror, the secret that I felt afraid for my life, the secret that this was not love, it was pathological abuse and it nearly killed me. That repression of that truth fixates, arrests that part of the psyche with the entirety of the emotional charge of a fear of death in a rigid, frozen state, which is constantly leaning the psyche over into the feeling of terror. You're a powerful man. You've got this, you've got this. It's tipping the psyche. I feel terrified. I feel terrified. Why? Get it away from me. Get it away from me. I don't want to feel that. That never happened. I don't want to feel that. It's tipping the psyche. And that tipping can come back to center in one of two ways. Receiving competent help, facing death, reintegrating it in the body, in the traumatic feeling that one is going to die, passing through the narrows of that biological message and coming into center and integration. Now the tipping isn't occurring, or the balancing can occur by enacting and giving that terror to someone else, so that I'm receiving that terror from my abuser and I'm giving that terror to my child, to my employee, to my frightened partner. I'm shaming the person who needs my help the most to balance the fact that the terrified infant in me that needs the most help is being shamed, is being hated. I have parents raging that the child needs food at the time we're busy fighting. That fucking child, don't they understand? I've got a point to make. The rage at the child for needing at that most vulnerable moment becomes discharged as the rage to a vulnerable part in the community or the psyche that needs my help at this moment. It's the only two ways to get equilibrium: to discharge the abuse passively, secretly, unconsciously, or to heal the abuse. And this cannot be done without facing the visceral symptoms of biological death. Because without that level of fear, you don't get the dissociated infant and child in the first place. And when this happens pre-language, in a cult that doesn't deal with the reality of physiological memory, it's basically buried. You have no clue. You were told you were loved and had a happy childhood. You believed the cult. You've dissociated that part. Everyone says that's just nothing and no big deal. Don't look back there. And now all you've got as a clue that something may be wrong is this compulsive rage to strangle, to hit, to hurt that which is most vulnerable within and without. In that state, any other person can trigger the abusive dynamic, can manipulate the abuser with the fear of being caught, the fear of being exposed. And so you get a sophisticated web of abuse contracts, often power structures at the top, corruption at the top of the church, corruption at the top of government, corruption on top of another government. We won't expose your dirt if you don't expose ours. You let us abuse the people we abuse, and you get to abuse the people we abuse. You let the Nazis burn 6 million Jews. We will not condemn you as the Catholic Church. You let us have our 5% pedophilic priests and take the money of the poor so that we can buy gems and riches for the Pope and all of that, and we're all good. It's rare for this to be broken without help, because the deep biological instinct of the ego is to avoid this biological terrain of reintegration at the pain of death. I will drink myself to death. I will run away. I will lie. I will abandon you. I will attack you for telling the truth. I will do anything rather than feel and relive the terror of the abused child. We are all capable of murder, betrayal, lies, violation to self and others in this unintegrated state. And far from helping our young people, we send them to wars, we engage them in capitalist brutality, the destruction of families to save a few pennies and send jobs overseas, one thing over another, and all in the name of what? An abusive dynamic that we've made more important than human beings. This is why men were initiated in many of the most healthy and dignified cultures by facing the fear of death before being considered an adult. Very crude initiations in some of the early tribes, get the hell out of here. You're 12 years old, you're 14 years old. Go face death. Get the hell out of here. Come back in a month. It's dark. They're alone. They're terrified. There's predators. Some died. Some broke through. You face the sheer terror of loneliness, betrayal. Everything that's there comes up. If you make it through, we want you back in the tribe. You are now an adult. Very crude initiation, obviously, and very crude early tribes. Later initiation is a much different process. The older men come and steal the 6-year-old boy in war gear. They steal him away from the mother, the comfort of the cult's familiar pattern. They force him to fight with the older men, and they let the child win, reenacting the confrontation that must take place between the ego and the cult in which it was raised, to develop an inner center, to restore the center to the inner core. Because every cult steals it away in some level. And before you can be an adult, you've got to get it back. Every cult steals it away because every cult is flawed. Every cult is asymmetrical. And every cult imposes that wound on its infant, who will do whatever it takes to attune, not to themselves, but to what is demanded of them. In the cult, the survival-based abuse contract, that must be reclaimed before you can contribute your truth and your essence to the tribe. We do not reclaim, prompting Robert Bly to write his book, A Society of Siblings. A society of children with no initiation, with a pampering dynamic to avoid this terrain within the psyche, having initiated the wound, but avoid dealing with it. And creating generations of grown-ups who are not adults, who are not able and willing to fight the cult, or champion the innocent, or protect the feminine in themselves or anyone else, because to do so means facing death in a cult that is terrified of discomfort, terrified of pain. I mention this because numbers of people have commented on my brilliant mind. Wow, you saw that. No one else saw that. Wow, that's really intelligent. Oh, that's very interesting. Wow, you are able to say all that. That's great. You're the kind of partner I want to be in relationship with. None of them grasp this partition between the biological wound and its pattern of reenactment and the dissociated pattern analyzer of the sociopathic brain that is out of touch with the planet, its own body, the feminine, and itself. That reuniting does not occur without the facing of death. Now, I do not know any adults. I haven't met them. I'm sure they're there, here and there. I don't know any adults. I'm 30% the way there because I've faced 30% of my terror of death. We do not have the birth of the transcendent human being who would gladly and willingly die to protect the code of life, to protect the innocent, to serve the species. As an innate joy, as a form of service. We do not produce that until we produce a protocol for allowing our young men to face death for the second time, this time consciously and this time winning. The first time every infant faces death in the rage of the giants. They capitulate, they lie, they adapt, they collude, and do whatever is needed to survive. That's the first time we all faced death. Every confrontation with a destructive authority, with a corrupt power structure, will follow the pattern of the abuse template of colluding, denying, minimizing, avoiding, griping and moaning but not confronting, until we go through initiation, until we face death a second time, reclaiming the self and win.